Okay, so let's move on from the investigations module. Let's start talking about the enforcement response module. We identified a violation in that investigation, and it is now sitting on our dashboard waiting to be dealt with. So I need to begin an enforcement response to deal with this violation. Same could be said of any inspection that had violations that's closed, or something we'll come back to a little later, which is quick violation notices. So there's a couple of ways that I can initiate an enforcement response. If I look at a closed inspection that had violations noted, let's go back a little further. Looking for a closed inspection here with some violations. Here we go. So there's a function in CalPEATS right now that it's on inspections, but you're not using it, which is this new enforcement response button. So just like I showed you, if we have an inspection, I can begin an investigation from it. Once the inspection is closed, I can also begin a new enforcement response. And as you can imagine, if I'm going to do an enforcement response on the violations from this inspection, there's some decisions I need to make before I can start that enforcement response. One of the rules about enforcement responses in CalPEATS is the enforcement response is only against one respondent at a time. So here's what type? This is a 104, PUMI inspection, where we have a PAC and a grower and a supervisor. Normally, in this case, the violations are going to be on the grower, but if this were a contract spray and we had a grower or an operator and a pest control business and a QAL, violations could be against any of those parties, and some of the violations may be against the growers and others may be against the PCB. So I'm going to need to identify for the enforcement response, what is it that I'm going to do? So when I click New Enforcement Response, which if you are using this module will be a feature your inspectors will use or you'll use frequently, first thing I'm going to pick is who is the respondent? Is this enforcement response against the grower? Is it against the PCB? Is it against the PAC? So I need to pick one and only one respondent. Then there may be several products identified on the inspection. I need to pick which products I'm going to carry over into the enforcement response. And then finally, which code sections am I enforcing on for this particular enforcement response? And then once I've made those decisions, in this case I'm saying the property operator is responsible for all four violations, and there's only sodium cyanide, so I'm bringing that into the enforcement response. Then I will click Create Enforcement. The process for going from an investigation to an enforcement response is almost identical. On the closed investigation, there's a new enforcement response button, and it gives you this same form to decide which components of the investigation you're packaging into this enforcement response. One thing there is not, I'm going to come back to this enforcement response and we're going to work on it. I just want to talk a little bit more about the process of starting enforcement. So we have the new enforcement response from a closed inspection, from an investigation. If we go down to the enforcement responses section here, there's no new button here. You can't create an enforcement response out of nothing. It's got to involve a violation that was previously identified in the system. Now at the end of our training session, we're going to round back up to 2 new features that were introduced, one a couple of years ago and one last year, that let you in effect do that. But for the most part, your enforcement responses are going to start with an inspection or an investigation. Okay, so let's go into that enforcement response I just created. That's going to be this guy right here. And let's talk about the enforcement response process. So the first thing to understand is enforcement response as a term has little meaning. It's a wrapper. And within that wrapper, you're going to have one or more enforcement response actions. And enforcement response actions can be compliance actions, which are warning notices, warning letters, not notices of violation, compliance interviews, cease and desist orders, that type of thing. Or you can have, enforcement enforcement actions, which is anything that requires due process. Everyone calls it a NOPA, but NOPA is actually just the first step in an enforcement action. So that's issuing fines or revoking permits or revoking, private applicator cards. So I don't think that's ever happened. Things that take away the right to do work or to operate that require due process and opportunity for challenge and appeal. And then there's referral actions, which is you bail out and send it over to the DA to pursue. Okay, so the enforcement response record is just a wrapper that contains those things. But there are certain things that we want to identify before we start actually taking actions. So let's have a walk through the form, and then we'll start talking about the individual enforcement response actions. Before I do that, I would like to just go look for a form. See if I can find it. I always try and find this thing and end up having a hard time finding it. I think that's the one. Come on. I always, in trainings way back when, I always called it the pink form because I don't know, for whatever reason, DPR printed it with a pink background. You all know the pink form?
Packages have a pink form.
Let's see if I can find the pink form. Well, I'll let that chug and I'll see if I can get back to it. It's a chart that DPR provided. It's like a big table, and on the left it has the three categories: compliance actions, enforcement actions, and referral actions. And on the right, it details all the different types there are in each of those categories. So we'll see if we can find it. That is the model that we used in creating the enforcement response package in CalPEATS. So the top of the enforcement response package, as with all of our record types, there's a details section. And that tells us who the enforcement response officer is. And there are some categorizations that DPR requires for their reporting purposes, which is the type of activity, the setting, the sector, and then below that we have our status, which is not a DPR thing, it's our thing. Again, as I mentioned, as you proceed to the higher levels of functionality in CalPEATS, the workflow gets thinner and thinner. We assume that anyone who is an enforcement officer who is entering enforcement responses into CalPEATS doesn't have a supervisor that reviews their work. So the enforcement response and all of its associated actions are simply in progress or closed. One thing you will find is that the system will not let you close the enforcement response until all of the actions that it contains are closed. So we'll come back to that actually quite a bit to talk about the process of disposing of violations and then closing out the enforcement response. We have an initiated date, a Dpr Notified Date. You're required to notify DPR when you take certain types of actions, particularly NOPAs. And so you can track the date that they're notified. The system actually sends notifications to DPR when you do certain things. So I'm trying to remember the name of the notice that you send before you issue a NOPA. But anyway, a lot of that is handled automatically. So all of your EBLs are registered in the system. They have email accounts that are registered in the system. And when you're getting ready to issue a NOPA, it'll email them and tell them that you're issuing a NOPA. So a lot of those notification steps are automated. Bless you. Okay. And then I want to mention something about this. This is really important. The enforcement responses that you enter into CalPEATS are automatically associated with the respondent. and they're associated specifically with the permit or operator ID or the license number of the respondent. Now, it is possible to write an enforcement response against somebody who's not registered in the CalPEATS, CalAG permits world, right? So they don't have a permit number, maybe an unlicensed MGB or something like that. And that's fine. It can just be a name and address. But if you are enforcing on someone that has a permit or has a license, make sure that this is correct, right? So a lot of growers also have a private applicator card. Some growers have QALs and do contract sprays for other growers in their area. If you're enforcing against their QAL, make sure it's the QAL that you've picked as the respondent. Because when you go to look at someone's compliance history, that compliance history is driven by the license or permit number. Okay, so if I were to write this enforcement response against the grower on their permit, and then I go look up the compliance history of their QAL, I'm not going to see this enforcement or any of the violations that are associated with it. So that's a really important part right here, is to make sure that you're enforcing on the correct entity. Okay, the next section is general comments. This is for your purposes only. It's not used or reported anywhere. We have a listing of the products that are associated with this. Generally, if you write a NOPA, the NOPA is going to call out the products that are in question. We don't have any features in the enforcement response module that generate things like NOPA letters. They're all so highly customized that counties prefer to write them themselves. But this is useful for reporting down the road. So if you want to see all the enforcements and what's the average fine amount on enforcements that involve LAN8 or something like that, having identified the products will let you do that type of querying and reporting. Then our ever-present and ubiquitous attachments, which you can use for anything you want. A lot of people, if this is an enforcement that stemmed from an inspection, they'll attach a copy of the inspection report or a copy of the investigation report. Again, all of those things are accessible in the system. So if I go back up to the top here, you'll see we started this enforcement response from this 104 PUMI inspection. And I can get to that inspection just by clicking on that link. It opens it up in a separate tab. And so I don't really need to attach the inspection report, but some people do just because that's the way they like to work. Okay, and then below that, we get into the really important stuff, right? This is the actual execution of the enforcement response. The first thing that we identify is what are the violations that we are enforcing on in this enforcement response package. And I use that term package just to keep reinforcing that the enforcement response is just a placeholder where you do actions. Okay, but in that placeholder, one of the really important things we have to do is assign the severities of these violations. And we can probably guess based on the code section whether it should be agri-structural, but because it's not a consistent and it's not guaranteed to be correct, we leave it up to you. So you're going to need to assign it as an agri-structural violation, and then under that you're going to pick the severities. So it could be Class C's, Class B's, Class A's, or obviously for structural, minor, moderate, and serious. You can leave these blank while you're doing your enforcement response actions, but eventually it's going to require you to fill these out before you can close this enforcement response. So let's get all of these assigned. If I am uncertain about the severity, I can read the code section by clicking on the code section and going to some details. But I can also hit view, and that will pop open whatever document that violation came from. In this case, the violation came from an inspection, so it's going to pop me into the inspection requirements, and I can go review the notes about it. If it came from an investigation, it would pop open the investigation, but that view will let me go look at the underlying document for this. And then here's something where I've got to take a little bit of a jump, and this is something eventually we'll work on. But another thing I'm going to want to know is, okay, what's the compliance history? Let's say I assign these all as Class C's, and I'm trying to figure out if I need to do a DR. I need to know the compliance history of this entity. And because of the way the databases work, that compliance history is something we display in CalAg permits, because that's sort of the master contact list for all of this. So I'm going to take a quick detour and hop over into CalAg permits. It looks like I couldn't find DPR's magic enforcement chart. I've had a real hard time ever since they decided to redo their website to meet accessibility guidelines. It's like really hard to find things anymore. Excuse the green stuff, that's just a weirdness of my Mac. But in CalAg permits under contact admin, if I go look up that grower, or could be a PCM or a PCB or an SPCM or an SPCB, whatever that license or permit number is that this enforcement is being done on. So let's see, I'm going to look them up by name. This was
San Diego Botanic Garden.
San Diego Botanic Gardens. Oh, okay. So if you want to look up the compliance history, you go to the contact admin page in CalAg permits, you look up that person or business, and down at the bottom here we have a compliance history section. So looks like in the test system I'm getting an error trying to retrieve that. But just so you know, for whatever reason, this is where that compliance history lives. And under here you're going to see the incident date, response number, the code section, the severity, what actions were taken, which could be violation notice, NOPA, etc. And then if fines were levied, how much were those fines? So it's just another side step while you're doing your enforcement responses to go look up the compliance history of that entity, particularly with respect to that code section. Okay, so back on my enforcement response package, I've now identified the severities. I'm aware of the compliance history for each of those code sections. I don't have to record anything in the system about that compliance history, but I may need that while I'm making decisions about what enforcement response actions I need to take. And then this grid is displaying PP, I can't remember what PP stands for, cease and desist orders, compliance interviews, warning letters, violation notices, public protection actions, decision reports, NOPAs, and referrals. Okay? And as I take those actions and record them in the system, it's going to put an X in each of these columns for me that tells me what actions I've taken for each of those violations. So let's take this, well, I'll just take them all as a group. I'm going to take all of these, and the first thing I'm going to do is write a violation notice. Okay, so I'll go down to response actions here, and I will say add a compliance action. Again, this is the tie-in to the pink chart, because all of those are considered compliance actions. And under compliance actions, I have public protection, cease and desist, compliance interviews, warning letters, and violation notices. So I'm going to write up a violation notice, and I'm going to include all 4 of these violation code sections on my violation notice. Okay, so that now we've got our enforcement response package, and within that we're starting to add response actions. Okay, so this is a compliance action detail. The type is violation notice. My statuses are just in progress and closed. And down here I can review and update any of the violation details that I need. And then down at the bottom I can generate a PDF. Okay, so generating the PDF is going to give me my PRNF 101 form. as a fillable PDF. So I can actually save this file electronically, type in my narrative, print it out, go get it signed, all of those things, and then when I'm done with it, I can reattach the final signed copy. So when I'm finished with it, I would go to my downloads, I would grab my, oh, I didn't save it. Save as, how do I save this? Here we go. So I'll enter my narrative. And then back on my violation notice record, I would then scan and upload that signed copy. Okay, so like I said, in the enforcement response module, we didn't focus on generating a lot of these documents, but we do provide you with fillable PDFs. We'll come back later and talk about instant violation notices. That actually lets you fill out the entire document in the system. But that suffices for now. Now, I've written this violation notice, I've had it signed, I've issued it, I'm ready to close it, but there's certain things I need to tell the system about this, this violation notice. Right? The first is, if I'm not going to take any more action, do I need to submit a decision report in order to justify taking no further action on all of these violations?
It depends on the class of the violation.
So, I mean, I know for 3 of them that the answer is no, because they're Class A and Class B violations. The system is not going to let me, and here we see the very first use of that term, dispose. Right? If I close this violation notice, I could dispose of this Class C violation. Right? Meaning I would not need to take any further action on that Class C violation. So remember, in my head, I've looked at the compliance history, and it's clean, and I've classified this as a Class C, and I've written a violation notice. So I could say decision report required no, and yes, I want to dispose of this Class C violation through this violation notice. This is a really important part of the enforcement response process in CalPEATS. So I want to know if you understand what I'm saying about disposing of this through a violation notice and not requiring a decision report. Is that the language that you all use here?
We close out.
Yeah, we close them out.
Yeah, we close them, we don't dispose
Okay.
of them.
We can use the word dispose, it's much more fun.
Yeah, I try to avoid the word close because it has so many different meanings and so many different contexts. But the idea that you get a Class C violation, there's no compliance history, you write a violation notice, you don't need to write a decision report, you're done. You don't ever have to think about that violation again until that same company violates that same code section later, and then you see that the compliance history isn't clean, and then maybe the next time you issue a fine. And also the fact that if I'm writing a violation notice, even though I may list the other violations on there, because they're Class A's and Class B's, I have to issue fines for them. Right? That's DPR's rule. If they're Class A's or B's, you have to issue fines. If they're Class C's and there's no compliance history issues, then you can not take any further action on it. These rules are...
You can issue you don't have to fine for a B, you can issue a decision report.
That's what I was just about to say is, I have heard that statement that I just made expressed 17 different ways by 17 different DPR people in 253 different days. It's not the exact words I'm using that are
Okay.
that important. It's the concept that there's this decision process that happens. This is the only place we have any rules on that, which is you can't dispose of Class B's or A's without a decision report.
Correct.
Only Class C's can be disposed of with no decision report. So if I were to, and I'm going to go ahead and do this, I'm going to go ahead and save and close this violation notice. But just understand what I'm telling the system, what the system's telling me is, if I say no decision is required and I close this violation notice, it's going to close out this 6684 violation. Now, please ignore the fact that containers not properly rinsed would never be a Class C violation. This is test data, and I'm just running through some examples. But if this were a paperwork thing, if this were not having something posted or something like that, this could be closed out as a violation just with the violation notice. Okay, so that's my conclusion, is I don't require a decision report in order to close out this violation. So I'm going to mark this as closed, and then I'm going to save and head back to my enforcement response package. So now when I look in my violations, we're going to see I've got violation notice column is checked for all 4 of these violations, because I wrote a violation notice that listed all 4 of them. But only this one is disposed, that Class C that I said yes, close that one out, no decision report required. Okay, so now I'm going to do some more response actions. So I'm going to take another response action, and it's going to be a compliance action, and I'm going to do a compliance interview for whichever one of these was a Class B. It's this 6724 violation. So it's a Class B, and I'm going to try and get rid of it by doing a compliance interview and submitting a decision report to DPR. Okay, so it's this guy, and I'm going to do a compliance interview. Form looks very much the same. We don't have a generate PDF, because obviously you don't do a PDF for a compliance interview, but you probably want to upload a report of the result of your compliance interview and describe what was discussed and so on and so forth. And in order to dispose of this violation, I'm going to say a decision report is required, yes. So then I'll save and hit back. So now when I look at my violations listing, I'll see I did a violation notice and then I did a compliance interview. It's still not closed out because now I need to do my decision report. So again, back down to my response actions, and I'll say add a decision report. And it's for this 6724 violation. And on the decision report, there is a little bit more information that we provide to the system, because what's going to happen is when I click the submit button here, it's actually going to send an email to your EBL and let them know they have a decision report to review. And they're going to log into the system and review your decision report online. So I have my violation noted, I have my justification type, other describes specifics below, and here's my justification. I don't think they deserve a fine. Whatever commentary you have to provide to DPR, and if you wanted to, you could actually write up a longer report and submit it here in the attachments section. DPR will see all the attachments and all the text that you enter in. And then county prepare is I'm with Fred Blogs. And I am submitting this today. And you'll notice down at the bottom, we have this little section, Respondent Violation History. This is going to be, I said you have to go over to CalPEATS to look at it, which is true. But for convenience, because it has to be evaluated in a decision report, we also display that same history on the decision report screen.
I have a question.
Yep.
Where does CalPEATS pull the data for the compliance history for the companies?
I'm sorry, what is it, what?
For CalPEATS, where do you guys get the compliance history data?
Oh, it pulls it all from CalPEATS.
CalPEATS, okay.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I've always wanted to make that available directly in CalPEATS, but it was implemented in CalPEATS to begin with, and that's just where it lives. So we don't really we have this whole process with the technical advisory panel that prioritizes requests for enhancements, and there's always 50 things higher up on the list than my desire to provide another button for that compliance history. So it never gets done, but I guess everyone's really used to flipping back and forth between the two systems these days. Okay, so now we'll notice in my statuses, I have in progress, I have in review, right? So decision reports have a little bit more workflow around them. And then once I've saved it in review, then I can submit it to DPR. Okay, so right now in review, it's just my supervisor. Because I'm an admin in the system, I can review anything. But I would review it, and then I would say it's ready to go. We'll submit it to DPR. And right now, an email was fired off. Of course, it's the test system, so it doesn't actually get sent, but it goes off to the EBL. And when the EBL logs in, they will see that decision report. So let's go have a look at that. Did I get that right, Steph? Yes. Yay. So I'm logging in as a Southern Regional Office EBL, and this is my dashboard. I have a limited set of dashboards, but I see this decision report that was just submitted. Or actually, that's not this one, but whatever, same difference. And I can go in as an EBL, and I can review this, and I can either approve it or reject it. And if I reject it, then on your screen, you're going to have to take some more actions to close out that violation. If I approve it, then it will mark that violation as disposed. So I just need to think about for a second why I'm not seeing the one I want to see.
Would you go over how to deal with the rejected?
Here's the one I want. Within the system, each EBL is assigned certain counties, and the EBL I logged in at is probably not San Diego's EBL in the test system. But it's been so long since I've gone through the training, I forget which EBL account owns San Diego. So I just, as an EBL, said, give me everyone's decision reports, and I'm going to go ahead and approve or reject this one. So I'm going to approve it. And then I will log off and log back in as our county person. And head back into my ongoing enforcement response, which will be this one right here. Nope. This one right here. Now, I'll go back to my violations, and we'll see now I have decision report checked, and that decision report is listed down here as approved, which means that this violation is now closed out. Right? So now you're starting to see the rule set. If you have a compliance action written for a violation and it is flagged as no decision report required, and you flagged that violation to be disposed, then the violation is disposed. If you write a compliance action and mark decision report required, and there's a decision report approved for that violation, then it is marked as disposed. If you write a enforcement action, i.e. an OPA, and you get to the point where the commissioner has issued the final decision report, or the respondent has stipulated or paid, then the violation is disposed. So all these rules about how these violations get disposed. And if you write a referral action, then it disposes the violation, because once you send it to the DA, it's not yours to deal with anymore.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What if I write a decision report and it gets rejected?
Mhm.
How can I amend it on my end to be reset?
At that point, you would submit another decision report for that same violation.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no way to go back and edit a decision report. You would just write a new one, and if they approved that one, then that would close out that violation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I forgot to close out my compliance interview. I'm going to go ahead and mark that as closed, just so we can complete the process here. So now I have 2 more violations that I need to dispose. Both of them are currently marked as Class A's. So I'm going to go ahead and write a fine for these 2 Class A violations. So again, back down to my response actions. I'll say add. But this time, instead of compliance action or decision report, I'm actually taking an enforcement action. And I am including these 2 FAC violations. Now, the enforcement action process is a lot more complex than the others, and the form to fill it in is a lot more complex. So just to recap, when you take an enforcement action, the first thing you do is you write a notice of proposed action. So you decide internally what you're going to do. And the things that you can do are you can issue fines. You can also take what are called administrative actions. So you can revoke a restricted materials permit, or you can reject a restricted materials permit application. You can revoke a license, although you only have authority to revoke private applicator certificates, or you can reject an application for a private applicator certificate. So there's basically fines and administrative actions that you can take. Once you write that notice of proposed action and deliver it to the respondent, they have the option of stipulating, means they agree, just paying, which is stipulating without saying you're stipulating, or they can appeal it. And if they appeal it, then it goes to a county appeal. So a county appeals officer will hear their appeal and will make a judgment. And that judgment can be to modify the proposed action, or to reject the appeal, or to uphold the appeal and reject the proposed action. If the respondent is not satisfied with the appeal, they can then appeal to Dpr. And Dpr's administrator will issue a, what do they call it? They call it a decision notice. I forget what they call it. There's some formal document that they issue that says, okay, this is what Dpr says you, the Ag Commissioner, have to do in this case, which the Ag Commissioner can ignore and do whatever they feel like anyway, or they can, follow Dpr's guidance, which they normally do. And if the respondent is still not satisfied, they can take it to Superior Court. So this whole process has a bunch of different steps to it that may or may not happen. And that's why this form is kind of complicated, because we want to be able to track what has happened in all those steps. So let's talk about the overall setup of the form. In the top part, we just have a prepared by. These enforcement actions often are done by deputies or commissioners that don't really log on to computers and type in their own stuff. So frequently the user ID associated with this record is going to be someone in the administrative staff, and they want to identify who it is. So, this could be Ha, or it could be, Kara. You're a computer person, so you do your own, but whatever. In this case, I'm doing it myself.
I like to delegate, you never know.
I'll come back to the statuses in a little bit, but we have a summary here of all the dates where things have happened and the fines that have been, issued or paid. But then down at the bottom, we got several tabs, and these several tabs sort of follow along the time track of a enforcement action. So the first thing you do is you identify the administrative actions and civil penalties. Okay, and we have 3 columns within here, right? Because there's 3 places where those actions may be defined, and they may change. The first is the notice of proposed action. The second is if there is a county appeal, the county hearing officer will make their recommendation, and then the commissioner will issue their decision and order. This column actually could be a decision and order, or sometimes the respondent just stipulates after the appeal. So it's titled decision and order, but there may not be a formal decision and order. It could be a stipulation instead, but there was too many words to put in one column header. And then if there's a appeal to Dpr, then Dpr's director will issue their decision on it. If it goes past that and it goes to Superior Court, you very rarely hear anything back on it. There's a place to enter the fines that were upheld by the court if you ever hear back on it, but it's not part of the normal tracking process for us. Okay, so you'll see right now only the NOPA column is enabled. It's the only one that has fields available to put stuff in. And the statuses up here kind of track along with it. So NOPA issued, county closed, Dpr appeal, Superior Court hearing, and so on. So as the status progresses, the column will change to whatever column is relevant for that particular status. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is say, we're going to issue a NOPA. I am planning to not take any administrative actions, but I'm going to levy a fine. It's going to be a $500 fine for this FAC 12973 violation. Complies with permit conditions, no it doesn't. And I'm going to issue a $1,000 fine for this labeling violation. Okay, so that's my proposed action. Now, I can save this in progress and I can go back and work on it. I can attach my NOPA letter here. Once I actually issue the NOPA, so once that NOPA has been sent, then I will record the NOPA issue date. And I will change the status to NOPA issued. Does that make sense? And then I'll save that. So, a couple of things happen. First, because we issued a NOPA, the EPL gets an email saying you've issued a NOPA. And I'm just about ready to remember what that notification is called. It's actually a report. It's a...
Enforcement action summary? Oh, enforcement action summary?
Yes, thank you. Yes. So the enforcement action summary goes to the EPL, although what they get is an email saying, go read the NOPA. And you'll notice here in our little summary, we start tracking our dates. So the NOPA was issued on 5/23, and down in the bottom, we get the CAC decision and order issue date is now open for entering stuff. But before we get to that point, some things are going to happen, right? So the first thing that we want to look at is the second tab here, delivery and response. There are rules about how long somebody has to request an appeal. And so we track it here. That's if you send it by certified mail, you can enter a certified mail date. And you will get a tracking receipt. Then once you enter a tracking receipt, we automatically fill in the response due date. Because it's, I forget what it is,
20 days.
20 days?
20 days.
If you don't send it certified mail, then we make the assumption that that due date is going to be 30 days. Is it 30? 20? Some other number of days after the regular mail date. Okay? So that's automatically calculated. You can override that if you need to for some reason, like COVID and the USPS is late, so you're going to move this out to, 7/1. And then we track the response received date, so they may respond immediately. And I'm going to put some future dates in here. The system assumes you know what you're doing, so we don't stop you from doing things like putting in future dates and whatnot. And then you enter the response type. They either stipulate, they request a hearing, they don't respond at all and the due date's gone, or they just sent a check. Okay, so in this case, they're going to request a hearing. And so that's sort of the second tab over, right? So that's the next stuff that happens after you've written your NOPA and you mail it. Then you track the mailing dates, the due dates, the response date, and what type of response was received. And again, you can upload the attachment for the response. So if they sent you back a letter, you can scan it in and attach it. And I will save that. So now we know they requested a hearing, right? Because that's in our delivery and response tab here. So now we can go to the next tab and let's enter stuff about the county hearing. So they requested the hearing on the 24th, and we've scheduled it for June 1st. And I'd save that, and I'd go away, and I'd come back June 2nd and say the hearing was completed June 1st, and I can enter the hearing officer remarks. So they may have said, reduce fines to $250 and $500. And then if the hearing officer produced a hearing report, which they should, you can attach the hearing report here, and I can save that. So now we've completed our county hearing tab. Now we can't go on to Dpr appeal, right, because we don't know if they're going to appeal the hearing or not. But one thing we do need to do is now fill out this next step. So what happens after the appeal is that the commissioner issues their final decision. And again, the commissioner can adhere to the recommendations of the hearing officer, or they can ignore them, or they can do something completely different. But whatever it is that the commissioner decides to do, you need to record. So we're going to say on the 2nd, on the basis of the hearing, the commissioner decided to follow the hearing officer's recommendations and reduce the fine to $250 and $500. And then the reason why this went down from $500 to $250 is it was rejected during a hearing. That's what those terms mean. So withdrawn, if you just decide to withdraw a fine because the hearing officer said you don't have enough evidence to prove this in court, then you would just set it to 0 and say withdrawn. Everything else goes into rejected at hearing and rejected at appeal. Hearing being the county hearing, appeal being the DPR appeal. We originally had, bigger visions for things that might go in here, like, lack of prior violation history and other things like that. But it's really just whether it was rejected at the hearing or the appeal, or withdrawn by you. Okay, so what happens now? And this is a very interesting point. Once the commissioner has made their decision, so we can reach this point, like I said, through different ways. The person stipulates, the respondent stipulates maybe a business. They pay. Or you go through a hearing and the commissioner issues their final decision. Right? So any of those three mechanisms gets you to this point. As far as DPR is concerned, once you reach this point, that violation is closed. It may go on to DPR appeal and to a court hearing, but as far as tracking it cradle to grave, that violation is closed. Your commissioner has stated their final intention as to what your enforcement action is going to be on that violation. So when every time we fill in a new column, once we're ready to save this, we'll kick the status into the next status, and you'll see the status is county closed. Okay, so it's really important to understand. We may track more information about this process, but as far as the violation is concerned for the county, it's closed. And if I just leave this as it is and I go back to our enforcement response, save and back, and look at my violations, both of those violations now are marked as disposed. So I don't have to do anything else in the system. I can now close out my enforcement response package because all the violations in it are closed, and I can walk away. However, we can track, so for this enforcement action, we can continue to track more information. So if they have a DPR appeal, we can record the dates and the appeal officer remarks and upload the appeal officer hearing report. And if we go to that status of DPR appeal, then on our administrative actions and civil penalties, as you would imagine, the next column's opened up. So if DPR further reduced the fines or reinstated the fines, we can record that. And then we can also track it all the way to the Superior Court hearing. If you hear back from the conclusion of the court case and you get information about it, on the last portion of the tracking, action and payment dates, you can adjust this fine total amount due. Okay, so if the court comes back and says no, pay $100 and you're good to go, you could put in $100 in here. It's just for your tracking purposes, though. As far as our compliance history and the fines that we're going to display, those are whatever the last column that's filled out on this screen are the fines that we're going to display in the system for that particular violation. Okay, so just really important. I want to reiterate that once more. Once you reach this middle column, the violation is closed. It's off your dashboard. The enforcement response can be closed. You can walk away and track no more information. If you do hear back, if the DPR director issues a decision that modifies the fines, you can track them here, and that information will become part of the compliance history for that licensee or permit holder.
Will DPR complete that, or are we supposed to complete it based on the information we get?
It's the information you get. Yeah,
So-
DPR doesn't come in and enter this information for you.
Even though we've closed it and put it off
Yep.
our desk?
Yep, even though the status here is county closed, this column remains open for you to put information into. And you can actually advance that status beyond county closed into DPR hearing completed, Superior Court hearing completed.
So I
So
guess
we
my-
have to follow up on.
Yeah, so that would be my question. Does it become DPR's responsibility at some point? And
No.
what did you say with the county?
No, they've drawn the line and said, once their director issues that letter, and they publish those appeal letters on their website, they're not gonna come in and enter this information for you. That's why we made it optional for you to track that information if you want to in CalPEATS.
Oh, so if we want to. If we want
So we're not
If you want to,
required
yeah. Yeah, DPR doesn't require you to fill out this last
We
column.
don't know that.
And I went back and I read some of those decision letters, and some of them are pretty vague. So sometimes it may be hard to specifically identify what each fine became. Sometimes the director just says, oh, the total amount of fines you're going to pay is this. And there were 7 violations, each of which had different amounts, and they don't specify how each one ended up. That's why I say, if you want to track this information, you can get the information, that's great. We don't report it. It's just there for you to query. But you can also override the total amount of fines due by putting in a different number here. And you can track the payment. So if there's no payment plan, you can enter the date paid and the amount paid. If there's a payment plan, then you can establish a payment plan by adding multiple rows into a payment plan table, and then you can track whether each payment was made. So I could say they're going to pay on July 1, they're going to pay 100, and on July, well, it's not July 2, August 1st, they're going to pay 100, and so on. And I can fill out a whole payment plan here. So it's very minimal tracking. I don't think a lot of counties are using it. The most important thing to know is it's the fines that are listed here, whichever is the rightmost filled out column. When you go to someone's compliance history and it lists fines they've received, those are the amounts that are going to be listed there. Okay, so again, this is a pretty complicated form, and you're going to have to go through the process a few times before you're really going to get comfortable with it. The thing to remember is there's kind of a couple of sequences. There's the sequence of events of tracking information that go across these tabs here, and those are accompanied by these statuses, and then these statuses are also correspond to the different columns for specifying what the proposed action or what the final action consisted of. And everything after the CAC decision and order, which is also the same place you would put in a stipulation or somebody you just paid, everything beyond that is voluntary, optional tracking. Once that column is filled out and the county closed status is reached, you can close out the violation. The violations are automatically closed out for you, and you can close out the enforcement response. Okay, so if I'm looking at this, I would look in my response actions. I would see all my actions are closed, all my violations are disposed, so I should be able to close out this enforcement response. I'm completely done here. And indeed, I can go up to the top and I can close it out, but I want to show you one thing first. Back on our dashboard, during the busy season, you may have a lot of enforcement responses listed in your dashboard. Some of these take a really long time, so you may have 7 or 8 enforcements active, or even more at the same time. So we highlight the ones that are ready to close in yellow. We haven't gone to the step of making this accessibility compliant, so unfortunately there's no highlight other than the color. And that's an issue we'll have to resolve later. But it does tell me that I'm ready to close this out. So if I go into view here and I go to my edit screen, I can now mark this as closed. And that will completely close that and take it off of my dashboard. Go back back to my enforcement responses, and we'll see that that one has now disappeared. So let's go back into an open violation or an open enforcement response package and just talk about two other components which we haven't talked about yet. Sometimes it's really hard to get one of these violations to get disposed. You're not going to take a fine on it, or you may have written an OPA, but you didn't actually issue a fine for that particular violation. So if you can't dispose of it through any of these normal mechanisms, remember the rules are a compliance action that is flagged as not requiring a decision report, a compliance action that requires a decision report plus an approved decision report, an enforcement action that has reached the county closed status, or a referral action, which I haven't shown you yet, but I'll show you that in a second. Those will automatically close out or dispose of a violation. You can then use this other drop-down to pick some other reason why you want that violation disposed. So under here you'll see enforced under another code section, and that's one where you had two violations, you issued a fine for one of them, you don't need to do anything with the other. You would just pick enforced under another code section, hit save, and that will dispose of that violation. The other reasons we have in there are insufficient evidence to pursue. So you can't just get rid of the violation because it was part of the part of the original record that you created for this enforcement response, but you can't pursue it. So you just mark it as insufficient evidence. Non-compliance is noted on inspection form. This is one where in the past you could just check the bottom of the inspection form saying a violation notice was issued, you write in a violation notice number, and on the pink chart it actually calls out violations noted on inspection form is a class of compliance action. So if that's the way you do it, then you just mark those as non-compliance is noted on inspection form. And then other is just other. If you have some other reason why you don't think you need to do anything about that violation, you can pick other, and then I recommend in the comments up here you just provide some explanation of why you felt like you didn't need to do anything about that particular code section. Okay, so that's another way to dispose of violations. The last way to dispose of violations is the last category we haven't talked about here, which is a referral action. If I take a referral action, and I'm going to take it on this FAC 12973, oops, and you can refer it to the DA, you can refer it to DPR, you can refer it to the Structural Pest Control Board, or other. Again, we always have this other category. So if I send this over to the DA, we don't track much information about these referrals at all. So literally you get the violation that's being referred, and then if you ever hear back on the case, you can enter a case violation narrative, a case outcome narrative, the total amount of fines that were paid and the dates the fine was paid. The only feedback I've had on that is that people say they never hear back when they refer things to anyone. So if you get that information, you can track it. We don't have much in the way of reporting right now on it because we don't have a lot of data in that particular area. And as always, you can attach a copy of your referral letter. So once I add a referral action and I close it, then that automatically disposes of that violation. So in my grid now, we'll see that that now is marked as disposed and it has a referral action in it. All right, and then one last thing on enforcement responses, and that is we frequently get into an issue where the inspection forms in particular are constructed in such a way that you will cite a fairly high-level code section. For example, PPE violations. There's one code section that covers all the different PPE items. And on the inspection form, you'll just mark that PPE item as being out of compliance. So let me go create an inspection and let's create that particular code section. So I'm going to do a new 104. In order to get this into enforcement response, I need at least a firm person inspected. So I'll pick on no one in particular. And I will go down to my requirements, and I will say labeling PPE was out of compliance. Actually, what I want is the other one. Regulations PPE. So this code section, right, 6738, has a whole ton of subsections that deal with gloves and masks and clothing and respirators and all these different things. I'm just going to mark on here that that code section was out of compliance. When I go to enforce on this, I'm going to choose to issue violations for each piece of PPE, each category of PPE that was incorrect. So I want to show you the process of how to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this as closed. And I'm going to kick off a new enforcement response. And Ostrika Farms is the respondent. We don't have any products identified, and these are the two violations that I'm going to bring into my enforcement response. So this is my enforcement response package. As usual, I'll go down to my violations. I will mark these with whatever severity I believe them to be. But now, instead of just issuing a $100 fine against 3 CCR 6738, I actually want to break this down into individual subsections and write each subsection separately and issue a separate action, whether it be a fine or whatever. So if you click on the section, code section name, you get this add remove subsections to violation. And in here I can say add code sections. So I'm going to add 6738. And I'm going to add, let's see, there's tons of them. Let's go down to coveralls, okay? So I'm going to click on the coveralls. If I view it, that just tells me the code section text if it's available, and then I'll click add. And then I'm going to add another code section, which is 6738. And this is for gloves, category G or H. They weren't wearing their category G or H gloves. Okay, so now I've split that 6738 into two of the specific subsections under 6738. And if I go back to my enforcement response, my violations grid now displays those two subsections, each under the original 6738 violation. And I can assign a severity to each of those. In this case, they're mostly going to be the same severity as the parent. But more importantly, when I go to issue a response action, whether that's a compliance action or a notice of proposed action, so I'm going to do an enforcement action here, it lists out the individual subsections, not just the parent section. So now I can create a NOPA for those two and issue separate fines for the coveralls violation and a separate fine for the glove violation. So it's something that commonly happens, you know, when you want to take a severe enforcement action on someone for, you know, major violations, you can split those code sections that are listed on the inspection form into subsections in the detail for your NOPA.
So
Or violation notice, or whatever you're pursuing.
when you're creating that inspection report, it'll limit the code sections you have access to.
Yes.
But then in the enforcement action, it'll open it back up to give you access to specific sections within that code?
Yep.
Okay. That makes
Yep.
sense.
Yeah, DPR controls the list of checkboxes that are on the inspection forms.
DPR knows all this, they've seen this before and done this, exactly what you just did right now?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, this was built into the very first version of CalPEATS that came out, and so the DPR was very active on the design committee for the system, so they're totally aware of all of this. Okay, so once you do split a oops, I went a little too far. Let's go back to my enforcement responses. Once you do split a code section up into subsections, you have to dispose of the subsections individually. You can't dispose of the parent. And if I decide I made a mistake and I want to go delete them, I can. There's a way I can do that. I don't remember how to do that. Huh.
I would guess click.
I'll have to
the
get back to you on
original-
that.
I would guess click the original section again. 'Cause
That's where I went, but I don't have a
Oh,
delete
okay.
button here. I was expecting to find a little trash can icon here. Well, if you get into that situation, then email the help desk. Help at CalPEATS. Well, you know that email address already from your inspections.
Well, there's a view or select. You don't go to like select or view. One of those wouldn't.
No, the view will open the inspection that this violation came from. And if I click remove here, it's going to actually remove the entire violation,
No, I
including the
meant
parent.
select.
This, that's used to select a different reason to dispose of that violation.
Yeah.
Yep. There's some way in there, I just don't remember how to do it.
Click on
Yeah.
each.
Okay,
one.
enough on that. All right, last note on the enforcement response package. Each of the components, the top level components, so inspections, investigations, and enforcement responses all have this activity log. And if you like those activity logs, you can use that just as you can in investigations to keep track of all the different things you do on the enforcement response. And that is it as far as enforcement responses go.
So if you had a company that I wanted to do part of the violation to the company and part of it to the licensee, branch one gentleman not wearing his PPE, how does that work?
That would be 2 enforcement responses.
Okay.
Yep. So 1 enforcement response would be against the business license, and 1 enforcement response would be against the individual license.
So you would go back to the inspection, highlight that contact individual and do it that way?
Yep. Yep. So just looking at, and that's, it's a really important distinction. So I'll go and look at a specific example. So if I'm doing a structural not fumigation, 2 of the things that I'm supposed to identify is the firm inspected and the person inspected. And that's part of the reason why the inspection forms were constructed this way. So we got,
Yeah,
they're all
just pick one.
exterminators. Terminix, I think is what they are, right? Yep. So here's their branch license for San Clemente. And then they're going to have a field rep or an operator or an applicator out there actually doing the application. So I can usually find a Smith. No Smiths. How about Jones? Do you know any of your...
I think
anyone-
you usually have to turn off
Yeah,
one
you
of
turn off
the.
on.
Well,
Yeah.
you shouldn't anymore because we actually import all of the SPCB licensees into the system,
Does Little still work?
so you can
for
find them.
Robert Little? Does he
No,
still work for-
no, he doesn't.
No, okay.
Try Williams or, there's lots of Millers. Wow.
Here we go. Field rep. Oh, yeah. Okay. Anyway. Yeah. So if you had PP violations, let's say you had a, incorrect gloves, and it's the company stocks the trucks, and you're going to issue that violation against Terminix, that's going to go against their SPCB license, their branch license. But if the gloves were in the truck and the person was wearing them, you're going to enforce that one against the individual, unless you decide it's a training issue, whatever. So you get what I'm saying.
Right,
And then,
a lot of times we document the 6738 against both of them. Because
Okay.
we want to document the Terminex if they're having issues or if Mr. Williams is having issues.
yep. So you can do multiple 6736. Where is 6738?
It's number 7.
There we go. So if I note that violation, and I would type in all my
Yeah, lots of
documentation
notes,
and
yeah.
everything. Then I'm going to edit and close this inspection. Obviously, I'm missing a lot of data, but
We don't care.
yep. So now I'm going to do an enforcement response, and I'm going to issue that enforcement response against Terminix, and I'm going to include this 6738.
Okay.
So that's going to be 1. Now I'm going to go leave this in place. It's still there. I'm going to go back to my inspection. And
And just do it again.
I can say new enforcement response.
Okay.
Now it says one or more already exist for this inspection, so I can say give me a list. So I've already got the one against Terminix going on, which I can go open here, but I can start a new one, and this one's going to be against Aben. Same violation. So now I've got 2 enforcement responses, same violation, one's against the company, one's against the individual.
Because we just like to document.
Hmm?
We like to document.
No. Yep. Absolutely. Well, it's the right way to do it, because in the end, when you look up the compliance history for an individual or a business, you want to see all the violations that were attributable to them. And this will ensure that this field rep license lists this PPE violation, even if Avon goes to work for some other company.
Correct. That's my concern. So I just want to make sure it's tracked.
Yep, absolutely. So, there are a couple of other aspects of starting enforcement responses that I want to talk through. And then take a lunch break. And after lunch, I want to go and cover, if you tell me that this is of interest to you, the manual entry Pramer and all the Pramer categories that are filled out by completing these enforcement responses, just so you're aware of how this feeds into the Pramer report. And then I'd like to cover some of the reports that are useful for tracking work in this module.
That would be fantastic.
Okay. So, when we first started, one of the things I mentioned many times is for different record types, there's frequently multiple ways to start that process. And for enforcement responses, we talked about from a closed inspection or from a closed investigation, you can hit that new enforcement response button. And that will pull in information from those records and create that enforcement response package for you. But there are there's 3 other ways to start an enforcement response that I would like to show you. So I'll just do a new inspection. I'll do a new 104. And as is often the case in the field, you go out and do an inspection. And you note some non-compliances. Actually, I did that the wrong way around, but that's all right. They're the property operator. The person inspected was a private applicator because they're doing their own application. I'm skipping fairly quickly over these because you all know the inspections module pretty well already. So I'll just go look for a private applicator here. So Arlen was doing the application, and there were some non-compliances, mostly paperwork related things. So labeling available, they didn't have the full label. The last page was missing or something of that nature. Somewhere else, field postings maybe weren't correct. Let's just say for the sake of argument that we've determined, I'm out in the field and I know these were issues that were corrected at the time of inspection. They're going to be Class C. I'm going to close them out with a violation notice. No other action needed. So when I close out this inspection, I've already showed you how we can kick off the enforcement process. Using the new enforcement response button. That takes us into the full enforcement response module, which lets me take all kinds of response actions and document the whole process. But we have a quick enforcement response. So a lot of times you're doing the same thing for these types of inspections. You're marking things as Class C, you're issuing a violation notice, you're closing it out, no decision report required, you're done. So we created this quick enforcement response process that lets you do all of that in one screen. And it says you can perform a quick enforcement response only if they're Class C minor violations only. So if I click on New Quick Enforcement Response, instead of taking me into the detailed screen, it's just going to prompt me for a few things. First, confirm all the information about the inspection is correct. And then down below, this is all just the inspection information regurgitated. Down below, we need to identify the severities. And we're only going to let you pick Class C or minor, because you can't do a quick enforcement response if anything is a B or higher, because you're at least going to need a decision report. This quick enforcement response process is just going to issue violation notices and close it out. But you do have to indicate whether it's ag or structural. And then you have to indicate which of the parties identified on the inspection the enforcement response is going to. So again, if you're enforcing the same violation against two different parties, or you're splitting things up, there's limits on the quick enforcement response. So I'm going to say both of these were on the property operator. And then I can click proceed to the next step. What it wants to know here now is we're going to generate a violation notice form, PRENF 101, but we're actually going to close the whole thing out. So once you're finished here, you don't go and do anything. So to do that, we need the violation narrative, because we're actually going to inject that into the 101 form for you. So I can put in violation narrative for each of these. It pre-populates it with the code section and the title of the code section. And then I can add, my actual narrative for each of those violations, and that's what's going to print on the violation notice form. And down here it tells me how many characters I have remaining. Once I got my narrative written, I can hit save. And now it's telling me this is what's going to happen. We are going to issue an enforcement response with a violation notice against Bonsall Farms with 2 violations listed on it. And if I want to go look at it, I can click this enforcement. If I'm done, once you do this a few times, you'll know. You can literally just walk away. So you can hit back to dashboard and go do something else useful. But if you want to see what it actually created, click on this enforcement responses search, and it will highlight. No, it's supposed to execute that for me. It will highlight that. Well, at least I can go find that enforcement response.
It's the bottom one.
So, is it? Bonsall Farms. Okay, thank you. And you'll see that, you remember this screen, right? This is the one we filled out when we were doing the enforcement response in full. Down at the bottom, it lists both of these as Class C's, violation notice, no decision report required, disposed, yes. And then here's the violation notice compliance action. And on that compliance action, you'll see it's attached the PDF, which I can then click on to view, and it has all the information filled out, including my narratives that I typed. So, this is very similar to just writing the violation notice on the inspection form, except that it actually generates a violation notice record with the 101 form for you. So that's called a quick enforcement response. Then the other way that you can introduce violations into the system and get them into enforcement is through what we call our instant violation notice, which, do we have them here? No. I'm going to have to show you that on the mobile device, and I haven't set up my mobile screen sharing here. So I'll save that for after lunch. An instant violation notice is basically exactly what we just did, but instead of filling out an inspection first, you just fire up the mobile device and immediately go to the 101 form, fill out the information for the 101 form, issue it, and when you close it, it does the same thing. It generates the enforcement response record, the compliance action record, the PDF, and attaches the PDF to the compliance action record. So those are the two other ways that you can introduce a violation into the system and get it pushed into the enforcement response module. Again, they're for very special, not special circumstances, they're actually very common circumstances, but they're for that special case where it's all Class C, you're going to write a violation notice and no decision report is required. Anything beyond that, and you have to go through the normal enforcement response process where you'll manually identify the response actions that you take and fill in all the details for them.